Okay, thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Reinhard, for inviting me, and welcome, Hall. Yeah, today we're going to be doing something a little bit different in terms of what you probably normally think about. And not only talk about early childhood life, I figured maybe some of you aren't early mums, so maybe we'll actually talk a lot about microbes and aging as well. So we'll intersperse those into the talk. And so as Deb said, I've studied microbes for a long time, mainly studying how they cause diarrhea and infectious diseases. So I have a really weird sense of humor, so that's why this is restricted for fecal content here. So we'll be chatting about that. So let's kick it off with this. What do you see, right? A baby, of course. Cute little baby, aren't they wonderful? So when we're done this talk, I want you to see this, a baby coated in microbes. And that's because that's the reality of it. Just because you can't see them doesn't mean you're there. And so that's kind of the gist of today. And what I want to convince you of is these microbes you can't see. Actually, these things play a big part in us as being both when we're kids and adults and even as we age. So to set things in perspective, let's go back to way back in the late 1600s, 300 plus years ago. There's this guy named Anthony van Leeuwenhoek. So he was a Dutchman, and he basically made fabrics, and he dyed them and sold them. But he really liked to look at his fabrics, so he started to grind magnifying glasses to look at these things. And he got so good at grinding these things, he actually made the very first microscope. And what do you do when you build a microscope, right? Well, you look at things. So he started looking at rainwater and all sorts of things. And one of the things he did is he swabbed out his mouth, put it in this microscope, held it up to the light, and he saw all these wiggly little things. He called them animalcules. These were the microbes in his mouth. And he made this stunning statement that basically there's more things in animals in their mouth than people living in the Netherlands, which is where he was. That's when microbiology was discovered, way back in the late 1600s, 300 and odd years ago. So what have we done with microbiology since then? Well, I need to remind you that we live in a microbial world. You tend not to think of it this way, but we actually are, these microbes built this world, and they're a key part of it, and they'll be here long after we're gone. So when you put up the tree of life, you can see that bacteria and archaea, which are really a form of microbes, these are things you can't see, they form the bulk of life. And the ones that we think of life, so the animals and the plants that we can actually see, they're just those tiny little branches in the branch of life. So microbes did things like they built the atmosphere, they made the oxygen, so we live in an oxygenated world. They're part of you, your mitochondria, which forms the energy inside cells. Those are remnants of microbes or things. So that they play a key role in this. And this is something we tend not to think about, but I want you to get into that. Okay, let's continue our history lesson. Let's fast forward to the late 1800s. There's these two guys, Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur. Very famous Dutchman, a Frenchman and a German. They hate each other. They're basically competing against each other. But what these scientists did is they showed that microbes cause disease. And up until then, they didn't know what caused these infectious agents. They thought it was bad swamp gas, and they had all these crazy ideas of what's actually causing disease. What these guys showed is that things like, cholera, Vibrio cholerae causes cholera, and tuberculosis causes tuberculosis diseases. But then Pasteur also did something else. He showed that if you kill these things, pasteurization, you don't get the disease anymore. So microbes cause disease, kill microbes, go and get disease. That's great. So what do? Let's go kill microbes. And this is what we've been doing for the last 125 years. We've gotten really good at it. For example, antibiotics really came online during World War II, and these were amazing. They basically saved lives that previously you would die of these infections. And I think this is probably the biggest medical discovery of the 20th century, the number of lives these things have saved. So you know that antibiotics kill microbes. So here's a picture of E. coli growing or some bacteria growing. You add antibiotics to it, it lyses them. And it's great. So it kills a thing caused disease. But antibiotics are not specific, and they kill all microbes, or many kinds of microbes. And we'll see this is actually having an effect. Okay, so we've got antibiotics in the late 60s. We had hand sanitizer. This is a wonderful new product. So let's put it everywhere. It kills 99.9% of bacteria. That's good, right? We want to kill bugs because it cause disease. And you all know that there's hand sanitizers everywhere, outside various things and stuff. And so this is truly a success story. So here's the last 50 years. Let me see if this works. No, I think I think I'll just talk through it. So here's the last 50 years of infectious diseases, 1950 to 2000. And really, you can pretty much pick your infectious disease. It's gone down. We don't have the polio and the smallpox and things we used to have. And that's great. So this is a really lovely success story. But where the plot really thickens is in the second half of this slide. On the right-hand slide is the same 50 years. Here we have asthma, diabetes, MS, Crohn's disease, autism, ADHD, obesity, you name it. So when you look around our world today, what kind of diseases do we see? We see these kind of diseases. We don't see infectious diseases. You don't usually hear of people dying of things that they used to die of 100 years ago. So what's happening? What's happened in 50 years? That's not long enough for us to genetically change. It takes about 25 years for one generation of humans, and it takes multiple generations to integrate changes in humans. So we haven't changed as a species, but something about our world has changed. And so that takes us to the worlds of microbes. So when I look out at you guys, you probably think I'm seeing a bunch of faces, right? Wrong. I'm seeing a bunch of vessels for microbes. There's as many microbes in and on you as there are human cells. So I tell my students, you're more microbe than human. They get really mad at me. There's at least 150 times more microbial genes in and on you than Homo sapiens genes. And this is a stunning fact. We kind of knew, but we sort of ignored it until recently. Well, how did we come to this realization? Well, we basically got really good at DNA sequencing. So you may remember in the mid-2000s, there was the Human Genome Project, the quest. Could we actually sequence a human genome? And all these gene sequencers got together, DNA sequencers, they built these amazing sequence factories, and they got good at that, and we sequenced the human genome. That was a major milestone in science. But then all the sequencers looked at each other and said, uh-oh, we finished the human genome, what are we going to do next, right? We better do something. Someone said, hey, let's look at microbes. I hear there's lots of those things around. So they formed the Human Microbiome Project. And so now you could actually sequence microbes without growing them. Because if you try and grow the microbes from your gut, you put them on a plate, it's very hard because they don't like air and they die. But we can actually identify them just by sequencing. And so this took us into a whole new world where we could actually figure out what microbes are in you and on you without having to grow them on a plate. So the number of microbes are just stunning. There's 100 trillion microbes in and on you. What does that mean in terms of realistic numbers? Well, if you take a gram of feces, beautiful thought, the size of your little finger, there's more microbes in that feces than there are people in this entire world. So think of the mass homicide you're committing every time you go to the washroom. So they're really dense. There's lots and lots of microbes. That's normal. So I did the cool Bill Nye the Science Guy experiment. I was in the lab late one night, and what I did is I'm going to go the Anthony van Leeuwenhoek experiment. So I brushed my teeth really well, and I swabbed out my cheek cell, put it on a slide, and then stained it for the microbes. So that's the one on the left there. First of all, really sexy, cool-looking cell, right? Beautiful cell, nice nucleus. But see all those little dots on it? Those are microbes. They're just in my mouth. They're just doing what they do normally. And we know that they come in all sizes and shapes, and pretty much every part of your body that's exposed to the outside world has microbes on it. That's normal. That's not abnormal at all. So where are they? Well, they're basically wherever your body is exposed to the outside. So upper respiratory tract, there's certainly some. Every time you breathe in, you're inhaling microbes. The mouth, the oral cavity has a lot of microbes. They live there all the time. You know, when you go to the dentist and get your teeth cleaned, they pull off all that plaque off your teeth. That's basically the surfaces these microbes have built on your teeth. They're basically building the scaffolding they live on, and they're scraping them off every time you go to the dentist. Skin has some, and moist areas of the skin, armpits are much more, groin are much more than, say, for example, on the arms. Ironically, the microbes on your right hand are different than the microbes on your left hand because they do different things, right? One's on the cell phone, one scratches the head, one holds the pen, whatever. So they're actually different. Your genital tract, especially in women, there's a whole vaginal microbiome that's proven to be a fascinating area in terms of women's health. And then the real bugs are in the gastrointestinal tract. So that's when the huge numbers are. So as you go down the intestinal tract, they increase in numbers till the very large intestine, where there's by far the most of them. Okay, so you have microbes on you. So what? Where do you get these things? Well, you get them when you're first born. This is basically where you're first exposed to microbes. And birth is a very messy business, but I love to say that the very first birthday present a mother gives their kid is this big bolus of fecal and vaginal microbes. Gross, but that's actually really essential for boot-starting the kid. It kicks up the immune system, it kicks up the brain development, it basically tightens up the gut. It's basically, this is part of our normal biology. We've been doing this for millennia, and we know this is going to happen. So the first couple of years, the microbes bounce around for a while and sort of stabilize. And those of you that had kids, you know that when you introduce solid foods, there's a remarkable change in the other end. You know, if you ever have to change diapers, solid foods, you know, that's because you're changing the microbes. Then basically you hit adolescence, changes a bit. But basically, your entire adult lifehood, your microbes stay pretty constant, assuming you live without changing your lifestyle. If you become a vegetarian, if you move to another country, go live in India or something, yes, they change there. But generally speaking, if your life stays the same, your microbes stay the same. And they're unique to you. No one has the same microbes that everyone else does. We're very unique in our microbes. Then we'll talk about near the end of the talk, once you turn about 65 or so, your microbes fall off a cliff. And this, I think, has a big effect on healthy aging. We'll talk about that when we get there. Okay, so you have microbes. Do we need these things to live? Do we really have to have all these fine things living all over? Turns out the answer is yes. We know microbes are essential for life. And we've done the experiment both in humans and in mice. So this is a boy named David Vetter. They knew before he was born that he had no immune system. You cannot live in this world without an immune system. They know he'd die. So what they did is they birthed him sterilely by cesarean section, so you can keep him sterile. They put him in an enclosed container, fed him sterile food and water, but they had to feed him certain vitamins, because these microbes make certain vitamins that you absolutely need for life. So they kept him alive for 12 years. The only time he could go outside, he got into NASA gave him a spacesuit he could go in, but he had to stay sterile. He eventually died at 12 due to an infection. He lived, but this was not a normal life. And we know that he had many things wrong with him because we've done the same experiments in animals. We call these germ-free animals. They should really be called microbe-free animals. Their brains do not develop normally. Their gut does not develop normally. Their immune system does not develop normally. We do not develop as a normal organism if we don't have these microbes. They're absolutely key for us to live. Okay, well, do they have anything to do with disease? So here's a list of diseases. If you take a look through this list, how many of these are microbe-related? Of course, none, right? Who'd think that colon cancer, Crohn's disease, diabetes, things? Well, it turns out these diseases, the microbes that these patients have, are very different than the normal healthy controls. It doesn't say yet that they're causing the disease, but we know they're different. And this is what we call dysbiosis. Basically, the microbes are mucked up there. And the thought is that these dysbiotic microbes may be contributing to disease. Well, that takes me to my absolutely favorite experiment, and that's fecal transfers. So fecal transfers are exactly as it sounds. You take feces from a healthy person and put them into someone that's sick. And this has worked wonders for an infection associated with something called Clostridium difficile, which is an infectious organism. Let's say you have to go into the hospital for a hip transplant. The first thing the surgeons do is they fill you up with antibiotics because they want to avoid infections. Well, antibiotics carpet bomb the microbes. Yes, they kill the infectious things, but they kill off all the bugs. And it turns out there's beneficial bugs there too. And when that happens, Clostridium difficile, which is a nasty pathogen, can then come in and actually cause an infection. This has been causing many deaths in both Ontario and Quebec in people in hospitals. So this is a disease that's caused by antibiotics, so can we treat it? You get maybe a 20% treatment rate with antibiotics. If you do a fecal transfer, so you take feces from healthy people, put them into these people, you get a 94% cure rate just by transferring feces. You're saving yourself a life-saving disease. And this has just changed the whole tables, because this says we can use this for therapies, right? We can actually think about therapeutically doing this. By the way, this is a slide from a skit on This Hour Has 22 Minutes. If you ever want to see a very funny skit, you will certainly appreciate this one. Okay, so let's start off with younger kids. And I already told you that the microbes bounce around really early in life. By about 2 years or so, it starts to settle down and do this. So I'm going to tell you one example our lab's been involved in scientifically and just how this is actually changing things. So remember I told you that germ-free animals have a mucked up immune system. And this is something that we've really come to understand. These microbes really influence how the immune system develops. And that's going to take me to my story on asthma. So asthma is a disease of the lungs, right? You have an inflamed lung due to allergens and other things, and you basically have trouble breathing. And so just to put things in historical context, when I was a kid many years ago, we had one kid in an entire school that had these puffers. We thought the kid must be a mutant because no one had these things. Now, 20% of kids kind of have these puffers. If you go to the playground, for example, now you'll see the kids lined up, and one kid takes a puff out of the puffer, sort of passes the kid down next to the slide, they sort of pass it down the line, you know. The incidence of asthma has just gone through the roof in our world. And it's not just Canada, of course, it's developed countries. So red means bad for asthma, and basically, you know, Canada, the US, UK, Australia have very high rates of asthma. And so the question is, why? There's about 300 million kids worldwide that have asthma, and this is like the leading cause of pediatric admissions to hospital in Canada. It's a huge problem. You cannot prevent asthma. You try and treat it by basically taking oral steroids that dampen the lung inflammation. That's how you try and treat it, but you can't prevent it. So we don't really know what causes asthma. So let me give you some hints. If you live in a farm, you have a 20% less rate of getting asthma than if you live in the city. So I think this kid's grinning because he's riding a chicken. I mean, what a good time, right? That's got to be fun. Here's one that really surprised me. If you're born by a cesarean section versus vaginal delivery, you again have a 20% higher rate of getting asthma, which is not going to kick in to age 3 to 5, depending on how you stick your head into this world. That's stunning. If you have antibiotics in the first year of life, or the mother has antibiotics pre-birth, that also causes 20% plus rate in asthma. And finally, if you breastfeed, you drop asthma rates by about 20% compared to bottle feeding. What do these all have in common? Microbes. So the way I got into this, so I told you I studied diarrhea forever, and we were using antibiotics to shift the microbes in mice, basically because we knew that would make them more or less susceptible to bacterial infections. And my wife's a pediatrician, and I came home one night, and I was telling her all about this, really excited how we could do this. She sort of looked out at me in the corner of her eyes. You know, Brett, kids that get antibiotics in the first year of life, they have higher rates of asthma. And it's one of those comments that just stuck. So first of all, I went to the library, because I never believe, you know, wife. But of course, wives are always right. Guys, we know this. She was right. But what I couldn't find is nobody had done the experiment to say that microbes might actually be involved in asthma. There was hints, but no one did it. So I convinced a grad student, come into a lab that works on diarrhea, and said, hey, we're going to try some stuff with asthma, you know, and we'll just see what happens. The lab across the street had a mouse asthma model. So we thought we'd just say, well, let's just treat mice with antibiotics and see if we can change their asthma rates. Pretty simple experiment, see what goes on there. And what we found was remarkable, is that if you gave early life mice, really early, basically just weaning age, like, or even pre-weaning, you give them antibiotics, we saw asthma like we'd never seen in this model before. It was just off the charts with certain antibiotics. Other antibiotics didn't seem to affect it. If we did the same experiment with an adult mouse, we didn't see any change. So I said, aha, early life antibiotics have to do something. And we did a bunch of experiments, not going to go into them, but bottom line is they basically affect how the immune system develops, whether it goes to an asthmatic type immune system or whether it goes to a normal immune system. So that's mice, but what about real life? What about kids, for example? So we got hold of a cohort in Canada, it's called the child cohort. They're looking at 3,500 kids from birth to age 5, following, looking for various risk factors associated with asthma. So was there a smoker in the house? How were you born? Did you use antibiotics type things? And I said to these guys, collect feces. I said, oh God, there's Finlay and his feces again. Why would I want to collect feces? We're dealing with a lung disease, right? No, trust me, collect it. So bottom line is, they, for whatever reason, actually listened to me. They did collect feces. And we started looking at the feces of 3-month-olds and 1-year-olds. Now, 3-month-olds corresponds to the time frame we saw in mice as being important. 1-year-old was actually after that. And what we found is that, yes, indeed, if we could identify 4 microbes early in life, 3 months old, if you had these 4 microbes, you are at very low risk for asthma. If you didn't have these microbes, you're at very high risk for asthma. And the neat experiment we did was we basically took feces from a kid, 3-month-old. The kid now is older. They've got asthma later in life, so we know they went on to asthma. They don't have those 4 microbes. if you take that feces and put it into germ-free mice with no microbes, or you spike those 4 microbes in and put it into other germ-free animals, if those microbes are there, we block mouse asthma. If they're not there, we got mouse asthma. So that's what we're now looking at kids. Can we actually see the kids at risk that are missing these microbes? Can we put them back early in life and fix things so they basically might prevent asthma? Adult and 1-year-olds, it was too late. So if you already have asthma, this is not going to fix it now. But in the future, we think we can actually do something. So that's a neat example of how the microbes affect how the immune system develops. Now, microbes in the gut, their biggest job is to break down the food you eat. About 90% of your food digestion is not done by you. You leave it up to your microbes. They're living there. This is what they do for a living. Now, this field actually really got kicked off by experiments done by a guy named Jeff Gordon many years ago. He took fat mice and did a fecal transfer into thin mice. They got fat. He took thin mice, put the thin mice feces into fat mice. They got thin. And he took an obese person, put it in thin mice, they got fat. Just by swapping the microbes. Now, we all know that obesity is such a major problem, and it's increasing in the pediatric population. And what it looks like now is that microbes from heavier people are really, really good at generating extra energy per food unit intake. Microbes from thin people, ironically, are actually not that good at it, and they actually don't generate much energy. Now, it's not quite as simple as that, but I mean, you can see where this is going. And this field is moving so rapidly now that they're actually being able to identify microbes associated with obesity and not. You can easily take the feces from a person and predict whether or not they're overweight by their microbial composition. And to give you a hint of where this is going, in Israel, these researchers basically made 1,000 of these people wear these glucose monitors, and they monitored everything they ate, and they characterized their microbes, and they used machine learning to develop these sophisticated algorithms that they could predict which foods would trigger a glucose spike. Now, glucose spikes lead to obesity and diabetes, so you don't want glucose spikes if you're on a diet. So now for $300 US, if you mail your feces to a company called day2.com, they will analyze your feces, and they will say, if you eat these foods, you will cause a glucose spike, these one won't. And the neat thing is when you put this head, so it's basically a personalized diet based on your microbes that you have. And when you put that head to head with normal diets, it just absolutely annihilates them. It's working beautifully. So I did it just for the fun of it. And you get this cool app on your phone. And so just to give you an example of how it works, if I eat a whole wheat bagel, that's B- on a scale of A+ to C-. So B- is not that good. If I add cream cheese to the bagel, which I like, it still stands at B-. But if I add 1 ounce of single malt whiskey, it takes it to an A+. So there's my lunchtime meal, right? So I got the right microbes for that. I'm very excited about that. But you basically tailorize your meals, and it's really interesting to see how it all shifts. And the studies are looking really promising. So I think in the future we're going to see this personalized diet type thing based on what microbes that you have or you have. And there you have. They're very different with everyone. So that's obesity. Now another area that's really well known to be associated with microbes is something called inflammatory bowel diseases. So this is the 2 diseases called Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. And we know that basically your intestine is heavily inflamed. It's on fire, and it's inflammation then causes this disease. Now, what's causing that inflammation? Well, of course, it's the microbes. But it's been a heavily debated area whether it's because your intestine is more permeable in this disease, the microbes seep through and cause the inflammation, or are the microbes actually causing it in the first place? But this is an area that is showing some real excitement in fecal transfers. Ulcerative colitis, the transfers are showing really good, promising results, but it's donor dependent. Some people are good donors and some people aren't. So scientists are now scrambling to say, well, what do the good donors have that those that don't have, for example? And this is also an example of the only adverse event ever reported for fecal transfers. There was 2 twin sisters. One was thin, but she had this disease. The other was obese, but she was healthy other than the obesity. And they took the obese feces into the thin one. The good news is they cured her disease. The bad news is she became obese. So it's a very interesting thing. But anyway, I'm not going to say much about this, but this is an area that our lab has worked a lot on, that we know that we can take feces from a mice that is say, resistant to disease, and then put it into a mouse that's susceptible to an infectious disease, we can actually prevent that disease and vice versa. These microbes are playing a major role in shaping whether or not you get diarrhea. Probably the most fascinating area is microbes in the brain. So we call this the gut-brain axis. This is a fairly new area, and I'll talk a bit more later in the talk about dementia and Alzheimer's and things. But there's hints these microbes actually talk to the brain and affect the brain. Autistic kids have very different gut microbes than normal kids. That doesn't say it causes autism. It's just they eat differently and things, so that may be the reason. But there's some really promising, but still smaller number studies coming out that fecal transfers seem to basically decrease autism, the autism spectrum diseases in these kids. And antibiotics are known in many cases to seem to trigger these effects. So it's not proven yet, but it's a really exciting area that microbes influence how the brain develops. So I've tried to give you sort of just little samplings of different areas these microbes are involved in. So let's okay, well, knowing all this, can we actually do something about it? Can we influence how we raise our kids? So the problem is it's a balanced situation. So we don't want our kids to get all these infectious agents, so we're basically work on hygiene and things, but we want them to be exposed to these microbes. So you really got to balance it, and I think the problem is I call it the hygiene hangover for the last 125 years. We have worked to clean this world up so clean that basically these kids don't get the normal microbes, and we somehow have to let them get these microbes. So if you're a young mother, or you're going to be a young mother, you live in a condominium in downtown Toronto or Vancouver, you live on the 22nd floor, you medically have to have a C-section because 10% of all women have to have a C-section. You can't breastfeed because you have mastitis, you have to bottle feed. Dogs are not allowed in the condominium. Daycare's next door. Compare that to the kid 500 years ago in terms of their microbial exposures. I mean, this is a very different world. And I think that we basically have to think about how do we balance these infections with actually getting healthy exposure. So we know that when you're pregnant, microbes do all sorts of things. If a mother takes antibiotics during pregnancy, we know that will influence the kid's rates of asthma, for example. And just to give you an interesting example, if you're a third trimester woman, so you're in your third trimester of pregnancy, let's say you're a thin woman, but you decide, well, I'm pregnant, I can finally eat, I don't have to diet, I can eat whatever I want, and you actually gain more weight than you should in your third trimester. When that kid is born, that kid has a much higher chance of being obese than if you didn't gain that extra weight. And we think that's because the mother's microbes go more obese in that time period. The kid inherits these things and then makes it more at risk of obesity, even though the mother was thin. So even as early as when you're pregnant, we know these microbes are influencing how the fetus develops. I've already talked about birth. This is where you get your very first dose of microbes. This is really, really important. In mouse experiments, you would delay the introduction of microbes to later after these things are born. The systems are screwed up because they didn't get that stimulus when developmentally they thought they'd get it. And as I said, it affects all sorts of things in terms of development. We've also talked about C-sections versus vaginal delivery. And there's actually well, one of the companies I'm working with is actually working on colonizing children born by C-section with vaginal microbes. You can take a vaginal swab and swab it on these kids, or you can take vaginal microbes. And we know we can colonize these kids, but we've got to wait 3 years to see if it works in terms of asthma and obesity and other things we're looking at. So these microbes are really important for how you kickstart this kid. Breastfeeding, we've also talked about. This is. It used to be you thought that you got the mother's antibodies that protected you from infection. It turns out that you also get all sorts of microbes off the mother's breast. A vaginal-born kid, their microbes are very similar to the mother's vaginal microbiome. A C-section kid, they're more like the mother's skin microbes. They don't have the vaginal microbes. But the breast microbes, which you get during breastfeeding, are important because they're often the ones involved in breaking down breast milk. So breast milk is a bunch of these complex sugars that basically feed the kid. And it turns out there's microbes in the mother's breast that are delivered at the same time as breast milk. These things actually break down the breast milk. So the breast milk is not for the kid, it's for the microbes that you get either from the breast or the mother's vagina that actually then break down what you're going to use for the kid. So there's even formula companies now thinking about putting these microbes into formula, which would then give them the right microbes to break down these milk oligosaccharides. Okay, soothers, binkies, depending on what country you're in, they're called various different things. We put them in pacifiers, we put them in kids' mouth to shut them up, right? What does the kid do? Spits it out, right? So what do? You're faced with the soother just bounced all over the floor. Well, it turns out there's a study that you have two options. You go and wash the soother off in the bathroom and you come back and put it in the kid, or you just stick it in your own mouth, rinse around, and stick it back in the kid, then they spit it right back out on the floor again, right? That's what they do. There's actually a study showed that the parents that put the soother in the kid's mouth and then back in the kids, those kids had less asthma and obesity than those that ran off to the washroom, washed off all the microbes, and then put it back in the kid. And then related to that is the concept of hand sanitizer. I mean, you go to the playground, every mother's got a bottle of hand sanitizer hanging off their diaper bag. Kid goes up a slide, comes down, washes the hands and hand sanitizer, goes on the swing, comes back, hand sanitize again. You don't need to do that. And it turns out the antibacterial agents, trichlorosan, which is in hand sanitizer, is now actually being banned by the FDA because it doesn't do any good. Soap and water, and you don't need to do it all the time. I came back recently from a flight, it was a long flight, South America, I think, and this mother had a little kid beside her. It was a 6-hour flight. She used that hand sanitizer 22 times on that kid. She also wiped off the video screen and everything when she sat down and everything. Unfortunately, I didn't have a copy of my book. I would just said, here, read this, you know. So you don't need hand sanitizer. Yes, in an old folks' home, for example, where people are more susceptible to infections, hospital settings, yes, you need it, but you don't need it in normal places. Soap and water is just fine. Okay, here's a skill testing question. Pretty easy, right? Kids love to get dirty. I mean, they hoover up the dirt, right? So if this was so bad for us, why would we evolutionally have designed kids to try and put everything they possibly can on their face and their mouth in the dirt, right? I would argue that, well, maybe nature's just trying to figure out the world and expose these kids to what's normal in their world, so when they get older, they don't react to it and become asthmatic or allergic or things like this. So what else can you do? Get a dog. Dogs, what does a dog do? It goes outside, it rolls in the dirt, and it comes in and rolls all over the kid, right? This is what dogs do for a living. Dogs are great at bringing microbes into the house. And they're very good at that. And if you have a dog, you got a 20% less chance of getting asthma, which is really cool, just by the simple fact. We can actually take the feces from kids, and we can tell if they've got a dog in the house or not by their microbial signature, because dogs lick kids and kids lick dogs, right? And so we have bets on, can we identify what kind of dogs based on these signatures in the lab now, so we're working on that. Cat lovers, I apologize. Cats live in their own corner, you know, they don't, like when's the last time a cat licked a kid sort of thing? They stay, so there's no data on cats. They seem to be cleaner, and we have not seen any data saying they actually bring microbes. Maybe they bring dead mice in, I don't know, but they don't seem to bring microbes into the house. So diet, and we'll get back to this a little bit later too. Diet plays a major role in shifting your microbes. And we'll talk a lot about diet in a bit, about how it's important for health. But this is, you know, the stuff that kids eat, this plays a big role because, you know, the expression is you are what you eat, bull. Your microbes are what you eat, you know, and then basically, you know, and, you know, your mother used to say it's good for you. No, it's not good for you. It's good for your microbes that are good for you. So we've got that equation coming out now. So let's move on a bit and think about other interesting tidbits. Why do we stink? I know this is something you all worry about all the time, but you don't stink. Homo sapiens do not smell. It's the microbes living in and on you that cause all the odors. So armpit odor, mouth odor, bad odor in the mouth sort of thing. This is due to these microbes that are making these molecules that basically stink. And it's these things that are actually affecting the odor. Okay, let's spend the remaining minutes talking about the other bookshelf of life, and that's the concept of healthy aging. So this is a really morbid slide. Here's the top 10 reasons why the average Canadian dies. How many are microbial? Number 8, influenza and pneumonia, right? That's microbial, but Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, nah, can't be, right? Wrong. So I'm working on this other book with my daughter now, who's a gerontologist, and we're looking at these things. When you look at this, it turns out that 9 of those 10 reasons of death now have microbes associated with them. I'm not saying it's causing them all yet, but they're associated with them. And 5 years ago, you say you're nuts. I mean, this can't be. It turns out, and I'll show you some of the reasons why we're thinking this, the microbes are involved in this. The only one that's not officially linked with microbes is accidents. You can't say the microbes made me do it yet. But they do affect the brain. They affect, depression and things, so maybe. Cardiovascular disease. So this is heart attacks and strokes, 2 of the 4 leading causes of death in Canada. So this is basically the thickening of the arteries and the high cholesterol type stuff. When you eat red meat, which causes much higher risk of these diseases, microbes take these molecules in red meat, a thing called phosphocholine, and they break it down into a molecule, something called trimethylamine. And then your liver then oxidizes that molecule into something else called trimethylamine oxide, and that's basically what causes atherosclerosis. Now, for years they've been trying to drug the liver enzymes that form that product, and they haven't been able to successfully do it because it's too toxic. It's a liver enzyme, it's important. But the first step is due to microbes. So it turns out that you can actually make, in mice anyway, inhibitors of the microbial enzymes that do this first step, and you basically block atherosclerosis in a diet in these mice, which would normally cause this disease. Vegetarians and vegans have very low rates of this because they don't have the microbes associated with this. And they actually did an experiment where they somehow convinced a vegan who had never eaten red meat in their life to eat a steak. What happened? Nothing, because that vegan didn't have the microbes that would do this. Now, I'm sure if that vegan kept eating those steaks, they would rapidly acquire those microbes and then be at risk for this disease. So you can see where this is going, and supposedly there's a paper kicking around right now under review that shows that actually if you drug the human equivalent, you can actually block heart attacks and strokes in humans, even if you're eating red meat. So that's an amazing thing in the field of medicine to itself. Oral health. Pay attention to your oral health. This is really important. If you brush your teeth 3 times a day, you drop your dementia rates by 50%. Amazing. What does that have to do? Well, it keeps, and I'll tell you in a second how that works. So the biggest thing about aging is this chronic low-grade inflammation. It really boots up 65 and above, and we know that people that have this low-grade inflammation, that's basically what seems to affect how we age. You can actually take aged mice, do fecal transfer of the old mice feces into young mice. They rapidly increase the amount of inflammation and they age faster. Similarly, you can take young mice, do a fecal transfer of old mice, you decrease the inflammation and decrease the tissue damage associated with it. So this is something we call inflammaging, which is just a term for this low-grade inflammation. Well, if you have crappy gum health, microbes seep through and you trigger inflammation. And that's basically what seems to then affect the dementia type effects as well as cardiovascular type effects. So, the idea is try and do this. There's also twin studies that show that oral health plays a big role in dementia and Alzheimer's. So when you go to the dentist, they scrape off your teeth. They even do an acid wash. They get these things close to sterile. It really depends. So then it's a free-for-all to colonize the teeth, right? Whatever microbe adheres first dictates who adheres to that microbe, who adheres to this microbe. And there's a real hierarchy depending on who gets there first. There's now, for example, a probiotic gum that's now licensed in Canada. The idea is that once you get your teeth cleaned, you chew in this probiotic gum. It puts the good bugs down first, which then allows the good bugs to colonize instead of the bad bugs, which cause dental problems and tooth caries and gum issues. So even something as simple as oral health is linked to microbes. Skin health, the biggest reason for skin damage is the sun. And all the spots you see on your hands and all that. The sun is just a major skin. But there's also a lot of microbes in your skin. They're showing some interesting effects in terms of skin health. So where I talked about hand sanitizer, soap and water is just fine. If you take antimicrobial substances on your skin, you wipe out the good bugs as well as the bad. And then you have a better chance of getting a skin infection because the bad ones can now crawl in because the good ones aren't there to protect it. So I'm doing this. And there's a really interesting study, I don't know how real it is, there was 20 patients where they took 20 young Japanese women, cultured their skin microbes, then they took another 20 45-year-old Japanese women and put these microbes on their skin. These 45-year-olds had much higher skin health, less wrinkling, much more, they have all these different measurements of skin health, basically, so Bottom line, if you're 20, bank your microbes. They'll come in handy as you get older, decrease your wrinkles, maybe. We'll see. So let's get back to the gut-brain area, because I think it's so fascinating. So stress, anxiety, and depression, these are obviously common in our society. If you take a stressed mouse, an anxious mouse, or a depressed mouse, do a fecal transfer into a normal mouse, that normal mouse becomes stressed, anxious, or depressed, just by transferring the feces. That's stunning. I mean, these are brain diseases, right? Well, maybe not. There's a big study in the UK where they actually looked at antibiotic use over many years, and the UK has a social medicine system. They can track all the antibiotic use. Bottom line is a direct correlation with courses of antibiotics and anxiety and depression. Direct correlation. Antifungals and antivirals had no effect. So there's another big smoking gun there in terms of this. We've already talked about kids' disease. Another fascinating area associated with the brain is circadian rhythm. And it's exemplified in jet lag. So any of you that fly to London, get up the next morning, which is really middle of the night, you know how you feel, it's not pleasant. It turns out the microbes have their own circadian rhythm that seems to influence our body. And there's some really interesting studies. This Israeli group did these crazy experiments where he convinces grad students to fly to meetings around the world. He even said, I'll fly a business class, and all you have to do is take a little poop and bring it back. And so he took to all his jet-lagged grad students, and this is actually how these studies went on to show that they actually, these microbes affect circadian rhythm. Okay, so let's talk about aging in the mind, which is obviously a big issue, Alzheimer's disease. The rates of Alzheimer's in developed societies are going through the roof. Rural areas, they're not. And rural India actually has the least rates of Alzheimer's in the world. They obviously have other infectious diseases and things. But it seems to be sort of an urban disease, just like all those other diseases I talked about at the beginning of the talk. And here's what we talked about, the oral hygiene concept. Again, keeping your mouth healthy, keeping the inflammation down. So the whole goal in aging, I think, after writing this book, is that basically when you turn 65, your microbes get screwed up, your gut gets more permeable, these microbes seep through, they cause chronic low-grade inflammation, and this causes tissue damage and then causes X, and X is pretty much every aging symptom you see in terms of body breakdown. So obviously anything you do to decrease this is good, decrease the inflammation. And just to show you another way of doing it, is there's this thing called the MIND diet, which is basically the Mediterranean diet, and something called the DASH diet. So again, if you follow this diet, you can drop your rate by 53% according to this study. And if you don't follow it perfectly, you get a 35% decrease in dementia and Alzheimer's. Those are stunning numbers. So what's the diet? Well, it's all the things you know you should be eating, right? Fruits, nuts, legumes, berries, fish, olive oil, the good stuff, right? What should you not eat? The bad stuff. That's your red meats, that's your high-fat dairy products type things, fried to fast food, pastries, white sugar, white starch. This is what we all eat in our world. This is what we should not be eating in our world in terms of this sort of thing. And this has been shown to have very wonderful anti-inflammatory effects. We know a glass of red wine a day has a nice anti-inflammatory effect. So even by simply changing your diet, you change your microbes, which they can influence you. The other major brain issue is something called Parkinson's. So that's the disease where you're stooped over and you have this tremor, right? Everyone says this is a brain disease. Well, it turns out that this field has been flipped on its head because we're now starting to think it actually starts in the gut before we ever see it as a brain symptoms. So this all started when they were actually cutting the vagus nerve, which hooks the gut to the brain. Why would you want to cut that? Well, this is in Denmark. These people had these ulcers that were really painful. They found if they severed the nerve, they obviously cut the pain from it. When they retrospectively went back to look at these people, they had way less rates of Parkinson's by cutting the nerve that hooked the gut to the brain. No one believed it. It was a big study, but no one believed it. 2 more studies have come out showing exactly the same things, that for some reason, there's this connection between the gut and the brain associated with Parkinson's. So Parkinson's patients, they have very different microbes than normal. We can actually predict based on a stool sample whether or not you have Parkinson's just by looking at the microbes. We're doing this in the lab now. A major risk factor for Parkinson's is red meat. Okay, well, we already talked about what red meat does. And for the coffee lovers in the audience, there's good news. Coffee causes a 30% decrease in Parkinson's. Why? Well, what does coffee do? It makes you go, right? It keeps you regular. So it's thought that it keeps you motile, because constipation is the #1 risk factor. Chronic constipation, #1 risk factor of Parkinson's disease. I'm talking a brain disease, not a gut disease, right? So what's the connection? Well, it turns out there's this protein called alpha-synuclein. It's in the gut, it's in the brain, and this is a protein that's misfolded in the brain, part of the brain, something called the substantia nigra, that triggers the Parkinson's disease. What we think happens now is this microbial disruption in the gut, however it works, is causing this misfolding, this protein in the gut. And then it works this misfolding all the way up the vagus nerve, into the brain, into the substantia nigra, causes misfolding there, and at that stage we see it as Parkinson's. And so it's a very exciting area now that maybe we actually do stuff to actually prevent this degeneration, because they've even tried injecting stem cells into Parkinson's. You can't fix it once it's in the brain, but we think maybe we can get at it earlier in the gut. So we're looking in there. Okay, getting near the end here, I want to talk just a bit about cancer, because this is a field that I think the microbes are doing a great job of turning it on its head. So there are 10 known carcinogens in the microbial world. These are microbes that cause cancer. Papillomavirus causes cervical cancer, for example. Helicobacter pylori causes gastric cancers. We know these things. That's known. But I've also tried to convince you throughout this talk, these microbes really do influence the immune system. And we know that inflammation is a major cause of cancers, or seems to trigger cancers, so maybe there's links there. The real excitement comes recently in cancer chemotherapy. So there's been a major breakthrough in cancer chemotherapy called immune checkpoint inhibitor therapy. This is a fancy way of treating cancers where they basically, antibodies, monoclonals, are directed against suppressors of the immune system. So you remove these suppressors, and the immune system, T cells especially, go after these tumor cells really well. It works fabulously in many hard-to-treat cancers like malignant melanomas and small lung carcinomas. That's great, but it only works in about 20% of the people. Well, about 2 years ago, researchers showed that it depended on, in animals, what kind of microbes this therapy is going to work in. Well, a couple months ago now, 2 beautiful papers came out showing conclusively that depending on the microbes that you have, we can predict whether or not this tumor therapy is going to work in you or not. So now everyone's fast to work. Can we put these microbes into a person that doesn't have them and then treat them with this cancer, so we can actually, because it's a fabulous way of treating these cancers when it works. It's just spectacular when it works. So you can see how this has already changed the entire field of cancer. So I want to just kind of finish up on the concept that making the world clean has done wonders for our health. There's no doubt we live much longer than we used to. But quality health is now not so great anymore, and it's, with the obesity, the diabetes, all these other things associated with our generation type thing. So I'm starting to think that maybe we're endangering all those microbes we're supposed to have. We've evolved with them for a million years, and suddenly we just take them right out of the equation. They're not with us anymore. So this is what we call the disappearing microbe hypothesis. These are actually maybe endangered species. Because, as I've said, if you never get exposed to these things, we know that each generation there's less and less microbes in people, and we get more and more similar as we move into cities and live the same and eat the same kind of things. It may be convenient, but I would argue that's actually how we did not evolve, and this is a problem here. And some of the things we do, like antibiotics, for example. The average kid gets 10 to 12 courses of antibiotics before they go to school. What does a course of antibiotics do? It annihilates your microbes. These are just experimented in the lab, untreated, and then treated with 2 different antibiotics. You can see you get much different microbial compositions just by treating with antibiotics. So I worry that this constant barrage of antibiotics is actually affecting all these microbes. So I'm concerned we're actually taking a key part of our evolution right out of us, and we're going to recognize, think how your great-great-grandkids are going to live versus how your grandparents lived. It's a whole different microbial world, right? And is this good or is this bad? And I'm worried it's bad because, yes, we've gotten rid of infectious disease, but we're having all sorts of other consequences. So anyway, I'll leave you with that. So just to sort of put things in an overview, we've really, in the last 5 years, we have just opened up this amazing microbial world that we really didn't know existed before in terms of human health. Yes, we know we cause infections for a long time, but I also think they play a major role in our health. And so as we go about our daily lives, I would urge you to think about the microbes in your life too, because they're a key part of you. So you're not eating dinner for just you, you're eating for you and your microbes. And what are you going to feed your microbes tonight? They should have the broccoli, maybe not the steak so much. So the idea is that, if we can do this, we can actually, really enhance our lifestyles. So there's a very interesting book called The Blue Zones, and these are 5 areas in the world where people live a much longer time than on average. They're like Costa Rica, they're like the Mediterranean, Okinawa, Japan. And in the book, they go through and they look at what these people have in common. And really, there's 3 sort of tenets for long life, and I think they're all seen through the microscope of microbes. The first is social contact. You want to have your 80-year-old daughter looking after a 100-year-old father, and you've got the great grandkids and the dogs and everything running around the house. You have social contact, or have a good religion, so you interact with people. That's the first one. Social contact's important because you share your microbes. The second one is be active. Exercise, and we know, I didn't get into it, but we know microbes have a big role in exercise, and exercise has a big role in microbes, and it makes your microbes much healthier in terms of that. Now, you don't have to be a marathon runner, but you should be active, walking type things, playing tennis if you can, or whatever, just staying active. The worst thing you should do is sit in front of a TV for 24 hours a day in terms of activity. So these are obviously playing. And then the third one is diet. So when you look at what these people are eating, yeah, they have a pig roast on New Year's and they eat some red meat, but they don't make it part of every single meal. They're eating lots of fruits, nuts, whole grains, legumes, all the stuff that's good for their microbes. And so when you put all those 3 together, you can sort of start to see, the key to sort of long and healthy life, a lot of it. They say genetics plays only about a 20 to 25% role in aging, and environment's about 75%. So you can control that 75%, and that's where we can actually impact on aging. So I'm going to finish up on a very crass advertisement here. I wrote this book. It's called Let Them Eat Dirt. I co-wrote it with a postdoc in my lab. And really, it's a book written for the public about how microbes influence early life. And it's got a bunch of helpful things in, like quick tips, what to do kind of thing if you have to have a C-section, if you can't breastfeed type thing. And it's how to raise your kids with the microbes. And it's a lot of what we talked about today in this lecture. And so if you ever get invited to a baby shower, it's a perfect gift. And it's only $20 out in the lobby there, and I'll sign books quite happily for you in that sense. But it's neat because it's been a terrific success. It's been out in 14 languages now. We're making a documentary. And it's funny, I sit beside someone on a plane, she says, I read this really neat book about microbes, I'll let them eat dirt. I say, yeah, because I want to change the conversation and get away from this clean. If clean is good, cleaner is better, right? Not always. I think you need to rethink things there. So with that, I say thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Brett. So Brett will take a few questions here, and as he said, he will be outside in the lobby for other questions and follow-up, and to sign some books. Anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
Here's a CSI plot for you. The police discover a naked body and can't identify it, and their only recourse is fecal sampling. What can you tell us? Yeah, it's called forensic microbiology. It's a great point. Can you identify a person by the microbes? There's been some studies showing that. You can get a pretty good microbial signature. It's not as good as genetic mapping yet, but they're certainly starting to do this. And it's a whole field of forensic science now they're starting to develop. There was a study I read a couple of years ago where they could pick out a person out of 6,000 and they were able to identify them based on that. But I don't think we're at the, 1 in a millions genetically you can identify them yet. But yes, it's a powerful way of doing it, and each person has our own individual microbial signature, and it's unique to you. No one else will have that signature in the world, so there's a fingerprint we might think about doing.
Would you know what country they've been in recently and things like that?
Yes, you can tell a lot about that. Definitely people in China have very different microbes than here, for example. There's actually a company in the US now that works on identifying counterfeit goods. So you get a shipment of runners that's supposed to be from some country. They will do a swab on that. And then within 100 kilometers, they can identify where those runners are from. And they say, no, that's not from that. That's from China or wherever it's come from type thing because of the microbial signatures. So yes, you can certainly do that. In terms of people, diet plays a big role. You can tell, that shape your microbes. But pretend you're from India, move to Toronto, but you still eat Indian food in Toronto, your microbes will still be very different than if you're back in India, probably for other environmental reasons. But yes, good question.
Another question over here?
So if you made a big change in your diet, say becoming vegetarian, how long would it take to show up?
Yeah, so how long does it take to change your microbes in a diet? About a day. You start to see changes. You see them very rapidly. By about 3 weeks, that there's remarkable changes in your microbe. Now, if you switch back to the other diet, they do switch back pretty quickly. So you say, well, I was a vegetarian for 2 years, that'll do me for life. I can go back to meat eater. Unfortunately not. They will shift back to a meat eater, for example, pretty quickly. But they change quickly. Your microbes do change quickly. You know, every time you take a course of an antibiotic, you change them, they then come back. I recently have the lovely rite of passage of having a colonoscopy, which is a lovely experience for those of you who've done this. So you take this stuff, you swear there isn't a microbe in your gut. So I did the experiment of before and after, right? And it was really neat. So basically, here's me before, the colonoscopy, you swear there isn't a microbe in your gut. You just cleaned out. And then basically I snapped right back to where I was. They came back really quickly, which is quite amazing because I don't know where they came from. But the idea is with antibiotics, you take one, it goes like this, you push, and antibiotics, multiple courses push you further and further away from where you should be. So if you have to take antibiotics, I should say, if you have to take antibiotics for infection, do it. They will save your life or whatever, but don't take them just because, you know, you want to sort of thing. You should have medical reason for that. So they do change very quickly, and that's, I think, one of the advantages of this field. We can change them quickly. We can't do I can't change your genes, but I can change your microbes right now. And so medically, I think there's a lot of potential there. So, yeah.
Question here?
Hi. Could you speak to the future use of antibiotics?
Future use of antibiotics. Sure. So, as I said, these have been wonder drugs. They have cured so many lives. If you have a life-threatening infection that requires an antibiotic, do not hesitate. You know, don't stay away from antibiotics. But if you have a kid with an ear infection, for example, it's called watchful waiting. The pediatrician may say, go home for a day and see what happens. In Europe, they don't even treat ear infections with antibiotics, for example. So you want to use them sparingly, but if they're needed, use them type thing. Now, post-antibiotics, you can say take probiotics that affect antibiotic-associated diarrhea that do seem to fix it. And I would say if you do have to take antibiotics, I would say go on that mind diet or something. Eat lots of fruits, nuts, legumes, put the inulin on the porridge kind of thing. And really try and do anything you can to help bring your microbes back to the way they were.
Right at the back? Yeah.
Ah, right, probiotics. Yeah, I should have covered that. Yeah, so go to letthemeatdirt.com. There's a button that says probiotics. Push on that, and it will take you to a really nice website that basically lists all the probiotics available in Canada and what they've been proven to work in clinical trials. So probiotics is not regulated like FDA drugs. So there's a lot of claims out there that haven't been backed up by these. And when you walk into a probiotic store, there's a wall full of microbes, right? So some probiotics work for some things, but and there's been no probiotic study shown that they generally promote health. These are for particular medical conditions. So antibiotic-associated diarrhea we talked about. There's a yeast that works for Clostridium difficile. There's some works for depression with irritable bowel syndrome, IBS. So there's a few that work, but not all probiotics are equal. Another thing to know about probiotics is that they're often from a cow, a woman's vagina, or whatever. You're putting them in the gut. They don't stick. So the reason you have to take 10 billion a day is they just flush right through. Probiotics don't actually stick in you. It's great if you sell probiotics, you have to buy them every day, right? So I think this whole field is going to change and is changing quickly. We're going to see probiotics 2.0 or the next gen probiotics, and that will be multiple microbes from the gut, for the gut, with a defined health benefit. These microbes make anti-inflammatories that do this thing, and I think we're going to see a whole new wave of probiotics that medically work really well. So right now it's a bit of hit and miss, and I would urge you to look at letthemeatdirt.com and then the probiotic button, and you will see this. It grades the clinical evidence for these things actually working, and it tells you which microbes they are, what dose you should take them, and everything. And there are a few that work for some things, but the idea of probiotic yogurt necessarily fixing everything, the data's not there yet.
Okay, two last questions. Lady at the back, and then the gentleman up here.
Do vaccines have any effect on microbes?
Yeah, I actually skipped over the vaccine slide there. I don't know if you noticed or not. No. So vaccines, first of all, if you have a kid, get vaccinated. The data is overwhelming, and there's some also unfortunate bad science, wasn't even really science out there, fraudulent science really, showing vaccines cause autism. That was 16 patients, has now been shown in over 1 million kids that it doesn't do that. Yet you read the web, you can still believe that. So But vaccines don't shift the microbiota because they're designed for a particular pathogen that's going to cause a disease. The idea is you say, here's a piece of this pathogen, you teach the immune system what it looks like, so when that real pathogen, being a flu or being it tuberculosis or something comes in, the immune system's smart to this, it's wise, aha, that's bad, and then it attacks it. So you're not vaccinating to other normal microbiota type bugs, you're only vaccinating the pathogen. So vaccines don't affect the microbiome. What is interesting is we think because we know the microbes affect the immune system, we're now looking at ways of boosting the immune system when you vaccinate. So maybe we can enhance vaccine efficacy in certain cases by tweaking the immune system so the vaccines work better in some cases. And this is an area that we and others are starting to work in. The idea of tweaking the immune system actually works better for a vaccine. So, yeah.
Last question then, right there.
Yes, during trips to Spain, a few weeks in Iceland, Eastern Europe, friends I was traveling with said that they felt the food was much better for their stomach problems. Is that not making a difference?
I don't know what particular stomach problems they had. I mean, generally the Mediterranean diet is thought to be a really good diet compared to what we necessarily hear, for example. And I told you that mind diet type thing. So generally speaking, if you eat healthier in a sense, that should, in theory, make your microbes better, which will hopefully make. So what those diets do, all that, it's called the undigestible fiber, the inulin and things. You don't have the enzymes to break it down. Good microbes do. What they do is they break down fiber and they produce things called short-chain fatty acids, which are anti-inflammatories. So by eating lots of fiber, you actually basically, in a roundabout way, letting these microbes make these anti-inflammatory things. And I told you inflammation and things is bad for you. So it actually dampens inflammation that way. So that's one of the ways it's thought these diets work. The other way is antioxidants, red wine and things, and oxygen causes tissue damage, so by mopping up these reactive oxygen things, you can actually decrease the inflammation that way by decreasing it. So I guess it's probably, the Mediterranean diet, I think southern Spain, it's olive oil, it's all these good things that are good to eat, so that was probably why.
So I know there's a few more questions, so Brett will be able to handle those outside at the table with the book signing as well. So one quick announcement. So we have our annual science dinner coming up, and there are still some tickets available for that. It's actually going to be a little different event. It's going to be held at the Steam Whistle pub. So again, if you want to talk to interesting people, interesting scientists in an informal way, people like Brett Finlay won't be there, but other people, interesting scientists like him. Yeah, maybe he'll come. You can go to the desk outside and still purchase some tickets for that event. So it's just left to me now to thank Brett for a really interesting and fascinating voyage, I guess, through our gut. Thank you all for coming. And again, Brett will be outside and he'll be signing copies of his book. And again, if you have some questions for him, he'll be more than happy to address them outside. So please join me in thanking Brett Finlay for a really great presentation today. Thank you, Brett. And here's a very small gift that you can take with you on the airplane. I think it's a probiotic of some sort. No, again, thank you very much, Brett. Thank you.